Good morning and welcome to Morning Scoop for Wednesday, May 5th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Minnesota game is in 120 days, the game against Michigan in 206 days. This is shaping up to be one of the wildest off seasons in the history of college football. And after the craziness of last year, that's really saying something. The recruiting dead period ends in about 4 weeks, which should lead to a flurry of commitments and decommitments and flips for pretty much every program in the country. Before then, we have the transfer portal to keep us all entertained. The Buckeyes have already lost a pair of players to the portal this spring. That was a lot of P's all in a row. And apparently, supposedly, reportedly, or maybe close to adding one as well. My guest today is Buckeye Scoop beat reporter Tony Gerdeman. Tony, let's start with one of the guys who said goodbye Columbus, wide receiver Jameson Williams. Was that a surprise to you that Jameson Williams decided to hit the portal?
It was certainly a surprise once the name popped up in one of our group texts. And I was like, certainly not expecting it, but then after you think about it, it makes a little bit more sense. And that's, I guess, we know that's the time after spring practice, when players start to evaluate where they are. And the coaches are usually pretty honest with them, but they also know better than anybody where they stand in terms of the depth chart and things like that. And so we know Jameson Williams got bumped down a little. But yeah, I think he was not on my list. Let's put it that way. When we have maybe a mental list of players that the standard, the typical guys who transfer, he certainly didn't fit that because he was a returning starter.
Yeah, and seemed like he had potentially, maybe, possibly lost his starting job to the combination of Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Those three guys seem like they came out of spring likely as the top three. And, I think the return of Olave, it was obviously a great thing for Ohio State, but it probably threw some guys off and, threw some timetables off in people's heads that, hey, this will be a year I'm a starter. And then, well, now there's one less starting spot available. So that can throw some things off. Williams announced earlier this week that he was headed to Alabama. Now, is that bad news for Ohio State in that they may now have to face him in the playoff next year? Is that good news in that Ohio State apparently has a deeper wide receiver room than the Crimson Tide? Like, what? How do you read that?
Well, I think it says a lot about where Ohio State is right now in terms of their receiver depth. And I wrote about it after he left and entered the portal. Like, you think about all of the names they had at this point last year, when you could add Mookie Cooper and G. Scott into this list, and you're thinking, well, how are all of these guys going to play? They're never all going to play, but these things they sort themselves out. And we saw that here. And even when Jameson Williams is part of the situation in the spring, and you've got like 7 guys who probably could play, you're like, I know, how are all of these guys going to play? And then this, to me, you're losing a guy with 15 career catches. So, but also he's still a starter, and the staff saw something that they like. So there's definitely something there. But I think it frees up Ohio State more to play maybe more well-rounded guys. But then we'll also see how accurate that is once Jameson Williams gets to Alabama, where they'll throw the ball around quite a bit. And you look, they've got John Mechie returns as a returning starter, 55 catches last year. Even their number like 3 or 4, 5, 6 receiver, they had like 24 receptions last year, Slade Bolden. And you're talking about Jameson Williams, who had 9 as a starter. So while people just assume he's going to step right in and start, obviously Alabama wanted him. They courted him. They have a plan for him. The fact that they've thrown 2 guys into the NFL draft, into the first round of the NFL draft the last 2 years, and 5 in the last 4 years, the way they've used Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle when he's been healthy, they feature their receivers, provided they can be featured. They're featureable. And I think that's what we'll find out. That's one of the things I'm interested to see. We've always had high hopes for Jameson Williams. We want to see him kind of unleashed, and maybe we'll get to see that at Alabama more than we would have at Ohio State this year, because you've got Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. Alabama doesn't. And so I don't think it's a bad move for him. We'll find out if it's as productive as he thinks it will be this season.
Yeah, it'll be real interesting to see what he turns into there. And, and then oh boy, the takes. If he turns into something big there, oh boy, the takes. And yeah, that'll be interesting to see how much of that gets chalked up to development versus offensive system versus whatever. But yeah, I mean, you certainly saw flashes from Williams at times. He had that long touchdown against Miami of Ohio a couple of years ago, had a long touchdown against Clemson in the Sugar Bowl this year. So you have certainly seen flashes from him, but just, there was never a consistent. He was always someone you kind of looked, he'd make a catch. It was like, maybe this is it. And then he would finish with one catch for 14 yards. It's like, well, okay, maybe next week. And next week never seemed to necessarily come, and as writers, this may be a more specific thing just for us, but like, man, it is going to be fascinating to see all these guys potentially facing off against their old teams in big moments this year. I mean, we have seen, we saw Christian Smith and guys like that from Cincinnati a couple of years ago during a regular season game. And it was like, okay, it was a September regular season game and whatever. But, we almost had it with Joe Burrow and the Buckeyes 2 years ago in the national championship game. We could have had it with Justin Fields in Georgia if Georgia had gotten their act together last year. They really just needed a quarterback. That's a shame. But now you potentially have someone like Jameson Williams where, I mean, you sort of mentioned it earlier, the storylines you can have with Ohio State going up against Jameson Williams in the college football playoff semifinal, national championship game, whatever it is this year. Like, that is just going to be a fascinating storyline to watch. And it seems like with as many guys as are moving around from program to program, you're going to have a lot of those potentially this year.
Well, in this one specifically, I think Jameson Williams is so well liked by his teammates, his former teammates now. I can almost see some playful smack talk between maybe the defensive backs and Jameson Williams, or even Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson and Jameson Williams, because you've detailed it so many times about how much fun he has when his teammates score touchdowns, Jameson Williams. And so when a guy is liked well enough like that, you could throw some shots at him because it's all in love, and maybe we'll see some of that this year. And yeah, I think that's going to be the norm with the transfer portal moving forward, where you get some of these. It's kind of like maybe when the National League and American League started playing, interdivision and stuff like that, but now it's old news. Eventually, you facing your former team. We've seen that 17 times this year. But for now, it'll be interesting. Justin Bourne did it, and the guys like that have done it in the past, and it continues to be interesting until it's just old hat, and we're not there yet. I think we'll eventually get there, but certainly there's going to be so much said about that game if Jameson Williams goes off, assuming they meet, or if he ends up, this is his only year. Is he a one and done at Alabama and he's a first rounder next year, and you let that guy go when you didn't have to? So there's going to be a lot of talk about that. And I'm all for drama in college football. Aren't you?
Drama and entertainment and smack talk. Like, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I don't know if I'd be smack talking a Nick Saban team just because Nick Saban seems to take everything, even if it was meant in good fun. Nick Saban does not seem to take it in that manner, and has been known to weaponize that in the past. So you got to be careful with that with the Nick Saban team. But the other guy who did hit the portal over for the Buckeyes this spring, just to remind everyone, Max Ray, the offensive lineman. We've talked about him before, so we don't need to go into a lot of detail here. But just to kind of circle back on that one, since we're doing a transfer portal show, we're going to be completists, and we're going to talk about all the scholarship guys who are transferring out. To me, that one seemed like just a very logical move for all parties involved.
Yeah, and in fact, it was kind of a surprise that it took so long, because he had been, last year was his third year in Columbus, and then he finally got the start against Michigan State and played really well. And so he hadn't really played before then. And usually at some point, guys are like, well, they're getting passed by, they're not playing. You can see the writing on the wall. But yeah, so him transferring was not a surprise. And I think he's a guy that has shown, hey, I can play. And, it's where would he have ended up? And I don't know that he's announced a landing spot yet, has he?
No, not as of the time we were recording this, no.
Yes. So I think now he's almost becoming a more coveted free agent after seeing what he could do in the Big Ten in that one game. And sometimes that's all it takes to find a better landing spot. And, that's a guy we've talked before about how loaded the offensive line room is, just how deep it is and how many guys there are. I still think he would have been competing for maybe the second team right tackle, or, well, not second team with DeJuan Jones there, but, maybe a second team left tackle spot or something of that nature, or whatever side DeJuan Jones wouldn't be on. But you're around for so long, eventually you want to start playing. And then when you show that you can play in against Michigan State, I wonder if that even made him want to find a place even more. And so he'll land somewhere, get to play, and just, I mean, he was a top 100 guy, borderline top 100 guy. So certainly he doesn't expect to go through his whole career without playing. And that's the norm. I wouldn't be shocked if he's the last offensive lineman to go, just because there are so many. There's so many on the roster and only so many can play. And that's usually one of the spots that loses one or two a year.
Right. And, you want to have that level of depth on your offensive line that you don't run into issues where it's like, oh crap, we don't have a guy who can fit into this spot. So you want to have 14, 15 guys, but that means you're running 3 lines. And if you're the third team left tackle, you probably don't have a real clear path to the playing field. So yeah, that'll be interesting because Max Ray is someone who I think you would look at very differently if the Michigan State game hadn't happened last year, where, he would came in as a top 100 guy. And if he never saw the field and was, never higher than third string, you just, oh, he's a bust. It just didn't happen. And then you saw him against Michigan State last year and he looked good and he was graded as a champion and he played great. And it was just like, oh, okay, so maybe he's just buried behind a really deep, a lot of deep talented room, basically. So, yeah, I'll be interested to see where he ends up. His brother, Jake, who was at one time committed to Ohio State, decommitted, flipped to Colorado. He medically retired earlier this offseason. So that was one possible place that I thought, oh, maybe they'll go link up again in Colorado. And then Jake Ray medically retired. I mean, Michigan State has developed offensive linemen in the past and got to see him up close. So it'd be interesting to see. And he, of course, is a Tennessee guy, so maybe somewhere down south. So that's one that's worth keeping an eye on. Speaking of Tennessee, the nice thing about the transfer portal is that you can add guys and not just lose them. And there have been incredibly persistent rumors that Henry Toto, who he's the linebacker from the University of Tennessee, could be coming to Columbus. It still hasn't been made official just yet. If it does happen, though, what would Henry Toto bring to this Ohio State team?
Well, he's a linebacker loaded with potential, 2-year starter in Tennessee, all second team All SEC last year, freshman All-American the year before that. I believe he led Tennessee in tackles last year. May have led him in as a freshman or finished second as a freshman. Just an active guy. I wonder. He played middle linebacker at Tennessee. If he does end up at Ohio State, can he learn the defense quickly enough to play middle linebacker at Ohio State, or would he be moved to Will, the other inside spot? So I think there's some questions there, but would certainly bring an experienced linebacker because Ohio State has lost their top 4. And Taraji Mitchell and Dallas Gant and Kayvon Pope have played, so they are experienced, but they're not as experienced as a junior Henry Toto. So, but again, there's also the entire Jonah Jackson. When they brought him in from Rutgers, you're like, well, he's here to take somebody's job. How is that going to play off with everybody else? And he fit in really well. And Justin Fields, the same thing. And I going and getting him, if they can, it's as much about fitting in with the culture at Ohio State, because they're not going to bring in somebody to disrupt everything. And so there is also that aspect where it's got to be tough for coaches who can be cutthroat because they do want to, all they want to do is win, so they say. And then you're bringing in this era of free agency and mercenaries almost, but then they have to ingratiate themselves to their teammates while knowing that a guy like Taraji Mitchell or Dallas Gant has been here. This is their 4th year and they're finally in line to start. And then Ohio State tries to bring in somebody to put in front of them. So that can create some issues that maybe we haven't seen before, because they haven't really had this situation when they brought in Justin Fields. It's not like they're guys waiting their turn to start at quarterback. They're relatively young quarterback room at that point. But, Jonah Jackson coming in, there wasn't a guy who had been a backup for 3 years, and it's like, finally my turn. And so this one is interesting, and there's certainly some drama, some, politics. But again, if you get them in as early as you can, and then you try to build up the brotherhood, as they say, and see if that works. But it's going to be interesting to see if it happens, how well it becomes, like how well he can turn himself into a Buckeye, I guess.
You mentioned a couple names there that I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned Jonah Jackson and Justin Fields and, maybe potentially someone like Toto, who could come in and just kind of like, hey, there's one spot on the roster that just sort of needs a little patch. Like, hey, let's spackle the hole in the wall with this guy for the transfer portal. And who benefits more from the transfer portal? Is it like the Ohio State level team that can add like, hey, we really need a quarterback. Dwayne Haskins just left a year before we thought he might. We really need a quarterback. Let's go get a Justin Fields. Is that the program that benefits the most? Or is it like those MAC level teams who, when someone like, let's say Toto comes in, the linebacker room's already pretty crowded. One of the linebacker spots, may be more of a bullet spot for Craig Young or Ronnie Hickman. So then there's even fewer spots. So, does that potentially push another one or two linebackers out the door as they look for a spot with an easier path to playing time? So who benefits more? Is it the Ohio State level programs that can just like plug that one hole? Or is it, group of five, like MAC level teams who might be able to land a few guys who were perceived as like way out of their league a couple of years ago, who are now like, well, I want to go find a place to play. Instead of playing at Ohio State, I'm going to go play at Ohio University. And then all of a sudden, like, boom, you have one of the most talented players in your league.
I don't know if there's one or the other. And you could throw in the Power Fives who are a notch below the playoff teams as well, they're looking for one guy to put them over the top, or two guys, three guys to put them over the top. I think that's the best thing about the portal is it can help anybody. And you go back a few years ago, like during the NCAA EA Sports NCAA football game, like if you're running Ohio State or Alabama, you only lose guys. If you want to experience the joys of having transfers in the game, you have to be like Akron or something like that, or a smaller school. And then you have this trickle down economics of transfers coming to you, and you might get an Ohio State quarterback if you're in Akron or something like that. But here, you could the quarterback at Liberty, he could have gone to like an Alabama or an Ohio State if there was a necessary opening and become something there. So I don't think it's just one or the other. I think maybe who benefits most, the players, provided they enter knowingly and are good enough, because there's plenty of players who enter the portal who have nowhere to go and find out that they weren't good enough to grass necessarily wasn't greener and they should have stayed where at least they had a home. But I guess it just depends on who is most active, who is the best talent evaluators, who has a spot. I don't think it's one or the other. And maybe we'll see over the years as this becomes a norm, whether it goes one way or the other, who can benefit the most. I think it definitely benefits some players, but doesn't benefit all of them, because not everybody ends up with a place to go.
Yeah, you look at the numbers of players, and this is true in basketball as well. It seems like just about every college basketball team has like at least a third of its roster in the portal right now. And, there are programs with more than half of the roster. Cincinnati just fired its coach because they had like more than half of their roster in the transfer portal. And yeah, there are going to be a lot of guys who, the music stops and they don't have a chair to sit down in. So that's
let me just one other thing. We talked to Chris Holtman last week. Mm-hmm. He said he's talked to coaches at major schools who are only going to recruit from the transfer portal from now on, mm-hmm. which is just a huge swing away from how things have always been done. And it's because of the portal and because you can get guys in and they have experience, and it's a brand new junior college. It's like what Bill Snyder would do mm-hmm. at Kansas State, and now other schools are doing it through the portal.
Yeah, and since you talked to Chris Holtman, Ibrahim Diallo just entered the portal a couple days ago. So yeah, that is the music. The action is fast and furious in the portal, in and out right now. And let's just touch on it, because everyone is probably listening and going, why are they talking about linebackers? Ohio State needs corners. Like, okay, let's talk about it. The Ohio State defense probably would like to add another kind of set it and forget it kind of transfer to play right away at corner. Elias Ricks' name keeps coming up from LSU. That doesn't sound like it's going to happen. It keeps coming up. People keep bringing it up hey, I'm hearing that. And no, not yet. Does it sound like there's anything imminent there for Ohio State in terms of adding someone as a corner?
It really doesn't. And we have an ongoing thread on the Ask the Insiders message board of the football transfer portal. And anytime any defensive back from anywhere, shows up on the portal, that guy's tweet is put up there, and you got like, is he interested in Ohio State? And it's like, well, like Deshaun McCullough's older brother who entered the portal for Miami of Ohio. And it's like, well, he hasn't played in 2 years at Miami, so I don't know that he's qualified to play at Ohio State. So you can just call him down there. So yeah, there were some names early on that never really panned out and went elsewhere. And I wonder how much Ohio State has even really been aggressively going after it, because I think they like who they have. They know that they have to get better. They have to get more health, have to get healthier. But again, like, I don't know, somebody transfers from West Virginia. Can they play at Ohio State? You already have guys who need to get better, and then you bring in another guy who might be of that quality. Like, does that really help you if the guy you bring in has to have as much work to start at Ohio State as the guys who are already here? I don't think that necessarily makes sense. Just because they came from somebody else doesn't mean they're better. They're somewhere else.
Grass is not, in fact, always greener on the other side. Thank you, Tony, for joining us and kind of running through the transfer portal with me. There's another angle to this whole transfer portal thing that I want to talk about later on this week. And this is always dangerous to plug something before I've actually recorded the show. But here's the plan. What is it like to be in the transfer portal? Like, how does it all actually work? The plan is to have on a guest later this week to discuss that. It is something I am really interested in hearing about, because, you hear about the transfer portal. It's like, okay, yes, but how does it work? Are you contacting teams, or teams contacting you? How does this all work? I think a lot of people will be interested in hearing about that as well. That plan is to have that potentially tomorrow morning. We'll see how that works, but that is the plan. And if that does sound interesting to you, this would be a great time to subscribe to the Morning Scoop podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify. If you're already subscribed to that, why don't you subscribe to more of our wonderful Buckeye Scoop podcasts? Tony and I just dropped a new episode of Buckeye Weekly yesterday. The Gives in the Bank podcast, we plugged this yesterday, but they've been doing their Scoop 100 podcast series. Really, really good stuff. Alex Glettman has a new Around the Oval coming later on today. We have Dominique Smith's show, Beyond the Shoe. I mean, there's just a ton of great podcasts. Silver Bullets just dropped their first May podcast, I think, in podcast history. There's always Sloopcast has been active. Sloopcast is always at least once a week when they're in the off season. So there's a lot of great stuff on the Buckeye Scoop podcast network. Just search Buckeye Scoop on whatever your podcast platform of choice is. You can find all of our great shows. You can subscribe to them right there. Also leave us a 5-star rating and review, which will help other folks find those shows as well. Check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. Subscribe to that. That gives you all of our podcasts are there, but also interviews, highlights, a little bit of everything. And that's all at youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. And finally, buckeyescoop.com. Great site, lots of great content. I mean, we keep talking about it like this is the off season, and it is just everything is just going crazy right now. So it's a great time to be on our Ask the Insiders board to get the inside scoop on everything that is happening with all of these things that we're talking about right now. That's all at buckeyescoop.com. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys for joining us. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.